The sun filtered through the gauze curtains in the Harrow residence, bathing the kitchen in an almost cruel serenity. Rachel Harrow sat at the counter, her fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug, the coffee inside gone cold. Her husband, Mark, had left for work an hour ago, early again, and the silence left behind felt punitive. Their marriage, once filled with stolen glances and midnight laughter, had eroded into routine greetings and muttered frustrations. Rachel, 39, a former journalist turned freelance editor, had been sifting through Mark's texts while pretending to search for a client's number. She didn't expect to find anything until she did. The name Nadia wasn't suspicious in itself. But the tone, the phrasing, "Last night was everything. I can't stop thinking about you," slammed through her like a wrecking ball. The message was sent just 2 nights ago when Mark claimed to be at a client dinner. At first, she didn't cry. She just stared at the screen. Her breath caught. Then, her hands started shaking. Chapter 2. Erosion. Mark Harrow, 42, corporate attorney, sat at his desk staring at a contract that blurred into nonsense. He knew Rachel had grown distant, withdrawn even, but he chalked it up to her losing. Passion for work, or maybe the slow, creeping boredom of suburbia. He didn't want to admit it might be him. Nadia was a paralegal from another firm, vibrant and younger. Their affair had begun during late-night case reviews, fueled by whiskey, shared frustrations, and a dangerous sense of invincibility. It hadn't meant to become an affair, but when do they ever start with that intention? He justified it to himself. Rachel didn't listen anymore. She'd become critical, cold, but beneath that logic lay a guilt he buried under layers of distraction. Chapter 3. The confrontation. Rachel waited until Saturday. The confrontation was subdued, deliberate. "I know about Nadia," she said, standing at the edge of their living room while Mark balanced a basket of laundry. "I saw the messages." Mark didn't deny it. His face slackened, and something in his posture wilted. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said. "It just happened." "That's not an excuse." Her voice cracked. "You've been lying to me for months. Do you know what that does to someone?" A long pause settled like ash. "Do you want to fix this?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but laced with steel. I don't know." And just like that, a different kind of betrayal unfolded, not just the affair, but the absence of resolve. Chapter 4. Fractures and fog weeks passed. They slept in separate rooms. Mark continued his affair in secret, though with mounting guilt. Rachel didn't confront him again, not directly. She started seeing a therapist. She started jogging again, attending wine nights with co-workers she'd long ignored. But her eyes still stung at night. Her friend Leah, blunt and loyal, suggested a private investigator. "If you want the full picture," she said, "don't guess." "No." Rachel hesitated, but eventually agreed. The PI, a quiet woman named Gwen, returned with photos that told Rachel what her heart had already concluded. Mark had not stopped. In one picture, they were at a motel. In another, Nadia kissed his hand in a dimly lit parking lot. Rachel stared at the photos for a long time, then put them in a drawer. Chapter 5. Choices. Rachel confronted Nadia at her law firm's lobby, under the guise of dropping off papers. "You know he's married," Rachel said, her tone surgical. Nadia blinked, then looked down. "He told me you two were practically separated." Rachel almost laughed at the cliché of it. "We weren't, not until now." Mark came home late that night. Rachel was waiting. "I spoke to her," she said. Mark's shoulders sagged. "I deserve whatever this is." "No," Rachel said. "You don't get to decide that anymore." Chapter 6. The Investigation. One twist unraveled unexpectedly. Gwen, the investigator, uncovered that Mark had transferred money into a private account in Nadia's name. Large sums. When confronted, Mark swore it was consensual. A loan. She had debts, he said. Rachel was stunned. Are you paying her to stay with you? He didn't answer. This changed things. Rachel hired a lawyer. The financial betrayal layered over the emotional one. She contemplated exposing him to the bar association, but something stopped her. She remembered the man who once brought her breakfast in bed during her miscarriage, who read to her when she had pneumonia, who held her hand through her mother's funeral. How had they become this? Chapter 7. Stillness divorce papers sat unsigned on the table for weeks. Rachel sat on the porch one evening, the late summer air heavy with honeysuckle and remorse. Mark joined her silently. They didn't speak for a long time. I think I still love you, he said. I don't think I do, she replied. And yet she didn't move away. Chapter 8. Aftermath. 6 months later, they lived separately. Rachel had taken a part-time lecturing position at a local university. Mark moved into a rental apartment. Nadia was no longer in the picture. Whether she left or Mark ended it was unclear. They met for coffee occasionally. Talked about taxes, about the dog they shared joint custody of, about therapy. There was an odd peace between them. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but the stillness of people who had weathered something colossal and were still standing. Final. Scene in the final scene, Rachel sits alone at a cafe, watching a young couple laugh and share a pastry. She smiles, a bit sad, a bit hopeful. She takes out a pen and signs the last page of the divorce settlement. She doesn't feel victorious. She doesn't feel defeated, just awake. End. Themes explored. Betrayal as a slow unraveling rather than a single act. The complexity of emotional and financial infidelity. The ambiguity of love after trust has been broken. The limits and possibilities of forgiveness. The way silence and avoidance can destroy more than rage ever could. Mark Harrow stood alone in his modest apartment, the echo of his footsteps louder than he remembered from the day he moved in. There were no framed photos on the walls, no scent of Rachel's citrus shampoo wafting from the bathroom. Just dust, motes drifting through slants of afternoon light, and a silence he couldn't reason with. He stared at the final page of the divorce papers, a scanned copy Rachel had signed. He hadn't. His attorney had followed up twice. His finger hovered over the pen. Chapter 10. Shadows of what was. Rachel's lectures were going well. The students liked her. She found comfort in lesson plans, in office hours, in controlled conversations that didn't carry the weight of betrayal. But some nights, she found herself instinctively reaching for her phone to text Mark about something small. A song on the radio, a headline he would have joked about, the way the neighbor's cat had commandeered their porch. She never sent the messages. Instead, she wrote them in her journal, where she didn't have to explain herself. Leah, ever watchful, asked her over drinks, "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" Rachel's reply was hesitant. "I don't know if I want to. Forgiveness feels like giving something back he hasn't earned." Chapter 11. Interference. Enter Alan Finch, Mark's co-partner and friend, who discovered Mark's financial entanglements with Nadia during a routine audit. Quiet pressure mounted within the firm. Mark wasn't fired, but he was asked to take a voluntary leave pending review. When Mark showed up unannounced at Rachel's office, dressed in his suit but unshaven, it felt like a rupture in the careful distance they had maintained. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. "You shouldn't have come," she replied, but didn't send him away. They sat in her office, an invisible wall between them. "I ruined everything," he said. "But you were gone before I ever touched her." Rachel looked at Him for a long time. Maybe, but that doesn't excuse what you did. No, it doesn't. Chapter 12. Moral Weight. Rachel found herself caught between two truths. She still mourned the man he had been. She didn't trust the man he had become. Her therapist, Dr. Alden, suggested something that struck her deeply. Maybe forgiveness isn't about him. Maybe it's about releasing yourself from being defined by his betrayal. But wasn't rage also a form of power? Wasn't justice? She had the financial records, the PI's reports, enough to ruin Mark's professional life if she wanted, and she almost did. She had the envelope sealed and stamped. She stared at it on her desk for a day. Then, without drama, she shredded it, not out of kindness, not out of weakness, but because she didn't want to be him. Chapter 13. A Quiet Proposal. Months passed. Mark found part-time work with a legal aid organization. The pay was negligible. The work was exhausting. But it was the first thing he'd done in years that didn't feel hollow. One night, they ran into each other at a bookstore. It wasn't orchestrated, just a shared nostalgia for rainy Friday evenings and well-worn pages. They had coffee again, then dinner. One night, outside her car, Mark asked softly, "Could we try again? Just see what we are now?" Rachel stared. At him, heart drumming, mind a tangle of memory and instinct. "I don't think I want to go backward," she said. He nodded. "Then let's go forward, but together." Final chapter. Ambiguity. Rachel didn't answer right away. She walked him to his car. The wind carried the scent of rain. Before he left, she touched his arm. "If I come back, it'll be on my terms. We won't pretend it didn't happen. I wouldn't ask you to. And if I decide I can't, you'll leave me alone?" "I will." They stood in the quiet of an almost goodbye, almost new beginning. Then Rachel smiled, tired, genuine. Then maybe. Epilogue. They met for lunch once a week. They never defined it. Mark filed the papers a month later. Signed, done. Rachel kept her ring in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but to remind herself how easily something solid can become fragile. Sometimes love is like that. Sometimes it doesn't break. It just changes form. End. They met in public. They didn't touch. They spoke cautiously, like co-parents of a memory they weren't sure how to raise. And yet, it was the small things that softened her. The way Mark now listened more than he spoke. How he didn't flinch when she mentioned the therapist. How he never once tried to defend what he'd done. But something inside her remained tightly coiled, like a violin string tuned too sharp. Forgiveness was not an open gate. It was a lock that required time, context, and something Mark had never fully given her. The whole truth. Chapter 15. The unsaid Mark had a file folder in the bottom drawer of his desk. Not legal documents, not Nadia's messages, something else, a confession. He'd written it in the weeks after their separation, a letter he never sent. He'd revised it a dozen times, burned one draft, then rewrote it again. It held the tangled truth that the affair had started not after the final fight, but before it. During the slow erosion neither of them had admitted was happening. He hadn't lied only with his body. He'd lied with omission, with the weapon of silence. He brought the folder to their next meeting. She didn't open it right away. "I wanted to own the rest," he said. "You deserve the unfiltered version." Rachel studied his face. He looked older, softer somehow, not desperate, just honest. She took the folder and didn't speak. Chapter 16. Flashpoint, it took her 2 days to open it. The details hurt, more than she expected. There were moments he'd told Nadia things Rachel never heard, weaknesses he hadn't shared with his wife but gave freely to a stranger, And yet, it was that honesty that made her cry the most, because it was what she'd always wanted. Not perfection, just the truth. She tore out one page and folded it into her journal. The rest she burned in a silver bowl on the balcony. Chapter 17. Detour. Meanwhile, Rachel was offered a fellowship in New York, a year-long program in ethics and justice at Columbia. She didn't tell Mark immediately. She wasn't hiding it. But she needed to know what she wanted, not what they might become. Leah, ever direct, didn't mince words. You really going to stay in the same city as the guy who detonated your life just because he finally figured himself out? Rachel's answer was soft. Maybe I'm staying because I finally figured myself out. Chapter 18. The apartment key. One rainy morning, Mark found a manila envelope slid under his door. No return address. Inside was a single key and a note written in Rachel's handwriting. Don't wait for me, but if I come back, I'll use this. Until then, keep the door unlocked inside you. Mark stared at it for a long time, then placed the key on his mantle. Final chapter. If we return, spring came. Rachel boarded a plane to New York, alone. No promises, no expectations. She walked through the terminal with one bag and no ring. But the silence inside her felt different now, less like a wound, more like a waiting field, freshly tilled. In his apartment, Mark planted herbs on the windowsill, took up cooking, met people who didn't know his name from courtrooms or scandals. He didn't date, didn't hide either. Sometimes when he passed the mantle, he'd glance at the key and wonder if it would ever turn in his lock. But he didn't rush fate. Some love isn't broken. It just goes away for a while, to become something else. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it returns. End. New York swallowed Rachel whole in the best way. The fellowship was intense. Brilliant minds, hard questions, late-night debates over wine and worn-out syllabi. The kind of place that didn't let her hide. It forced her to grow sharper, clearer, sometimes colder. Her advisor, Professor Lillian Krauss, once said during a seminar, "The ethical weight of betrayal isn't just in the act. It's in the narrative we construct afterward to survive it." Rachel wrote that down and circled it twice. She realized over time that she was still writing the narrative of her betrayal, not Mark's, her own choices, her silence, her fear of confrontation, her need for perfection, which she'd confused with control. Chapter 20. The stranger in the mirror back in Mark's life, the rhythms settled. No courtroom drama, no scandal. Just slow, humble work, defending tenants from eviction, listening. To single mothers, arguing over county fines. People started trusting him again, but he didn't trust himself. Not yet. Maybe never fully. Nadia had disappeared, left the city, deleted her profiles. She became a phantom in his memory. Not the cause, just a symptom. He sometimes reread Rachel's note. He didn't interpret it as hope. More like a warning. Don't. Wait, so he didn't. He lived. He healed. He left space. Chapter 21. Ethan Rachel met Ethan Myers at a book launch. Another fellow. Divorced, smart, attentive. The kind of man who noticed when she needed an out from a conversation or when her fingers tightened around a wine glass. They started with coffee, then lectures, then evenings. No games. He was easy to be around. And most days that felt like a miracle. But sometimes, in the quiet space between a laugh and a kiss, Rachel felt the ghost of a door she hadn't yet opened. The one she promised herself she'd leave locked unless she meant it. Ethan asked one night, "Is there someone else?" Her reply was honest. "There was. There might be. I don't know yet." He nodded. "Then I won't ask you to choose. Just be honest with me when you do." Chapter 22. Return. Flight Rachel flew back to the city the following June. No warning. No letter. She carried the key in her coat pocket, her thumb brushing its ridges like braille. She didn't call. Mark didn't even know where he'd be. She went to the address where he used to live, unsure if it was still his. The mailbox still read Harrow. Her hand hovered at the door. And then she turned and walked away. Chapter 23. The Reunion. That wasn't. She found him weeks later, by accident, at a farmer's market, arguing with a vendor over the price of bruised peaches. His smile died slowly when he saw her, rebuilt itself cautiously. They didn't rush toward each other, just stood in the morning sunlight, strangers who knew too much. "I was going to knock," she said. "I left the door open," he replied. "I know, a beat." Then, "I'm seeing someone," she said gently. "I'm not," he answered. They didn't ask what now. They knew better than to demand clean endings. Final chapter, the weight we carry. Rachel gave Ethan her truth. He accepted it even, if it cast a shadow. Mark kept the key, but never expected the lock to turn again. Sometimes they passed each other in the city. A nod, a smile, a silence that no longer hurt. And sometimes, on days when the rain came soft and the world felt kind, they each imagined a version of life that might still unfold. Not as punishment, not as penance, but as the quiet possibility of something almost forgiven. Final line. Love, like memory, lingers not always to be reclaimed, but simply to remind us who we were and who we dared to become. Autumn settled in early that year. The wind carried a bite, and the leaves in Prospect Park crackled underfoot like brittle parchment. Rachel sat across from Ethan at their usual coffee spot, her hands curled around a cup that had long gone cold. She wore the same navy coat she'd worn on the day she almost turned the key. Ethan was watching her, gently, but with expectation. "You haven't spoken about him in weeks," he said. Rachel took a breath, uncertain how much of the truth to offer. "I think about him less than I used to. But when I do, it's quieter now. Not a storm. More like fog." "That sounds better." She nodded. "It is. But fog still hides things." Ethan didn't press. He only asked, "Are you still waiting for it to clear?" Rachel looked down at her coffee and realized she didn't know the answer. Chapter 25. The envelope Mark found a letter in his mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photograph of a room, Rachel's office, at Columbia. The desk was covered in papers, books, a coffee mug with a chip in the rim. On the back of the photo, a single sentence. "We don't always get to return, but sometimes we leave something behind that matters." There was no signature, but he knew the handwriting. Slanted, almost illegible in haste. Rachel's. He sat, the photo on his bookshelf, not framed, just there. Chapter 26. Leah's confession. Rachel met Leah for drinks at a small bar tucked off 10th Street. They hadn't seen each other in months. "You're quieter," Leah said. "Less rage, more resignation." Rachel smiled wryly. "Growth, maybe, or fatigue." Leah hesitated before saying, "You know, I saw him." Rachel looked up. "At the courthouse. I had a traffic case," Leah said. "He was arguing for a tenant being evicted. He's not the same. He's softer, still cynical, but there's something steadier in him now." Rachel sipped her drink. "I believe it. He always had it in him. He just didn't know how to show it when it mattered most." Leah touched her hand. "You don't have to forgive him, Rach, but don't forget that you mattered to the version of him that changed." Chapter 27. The Final Crossing. 3 years passed. Rachel took a teaching position in Boston. Ethan stayed in New York, and though they tried, they knew when to let go. They parted with kindness, with clarity. Mark moved to a smaller firm, started mentoring, volunteered at a local shelter on weekends. They hadn't spoken in over a year. But one day, fate intervened, quietly. It was a bookstore in Portland, Maine. They were both visiting, separately. Rachel, for a lecture. Mark, for a friend's wedding. She reached for a copy of The Ethical Heart, the same moment he did. Fingers brushed, eyes met. Time stilled. Of all the cities, Mark said, smiling. I was just thinking the same thing, Rachel replied. They didn't kiss, didn't cry. Just stood there. Two people with shared gravity, no longer orbiting pain. He handed her the book. Still drawn to moral ambiguity? She laughed. Aren't we all? They parted an hour later. No promises, no numbers exchanged. But they walked out of the shop side by side. Epilogue. What remains? There was no cinematic ending, no grand gesture. Just two people who once broke each other, now healed in ways they never expected. Sometimes they wrote letters, never sent but folded and kept. Sometimes they saw each other in dreams or in people who smiled like the other used to. The key remained in Mark's drawer. The photograph stayed on his shelf. Rachel still wore the navy coat on rainy days, and in the stillness of their separate lives, there lingered a gentle understanding. Some love is not meant to be rekindled, only remembered well. Final line. We do not always return to what we once had, but sometimes we carry enough of it forward to become something better. Rachel sat by the window of her apartment in Cambridge. The ivy from the neighboring brick building had crept up into view again, clinging with quiet determination. She wrote the letter in the early hours of the morning, just after a thunderstorm. She hadn't dreamt of Mark in months, but that night he'd appeared, barefoot, reading Neruda at their old kitchen table. She began the letter like this. Mark, it's been years, but your name still feels like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I never finished. I thought I was writing a different story. I thought we both were. She paused. I'm not writing to rekindle. I'm writing because the truth deserves somewhere to rest. She folded the letter and placed it in a small linen-covered box. A box filled with photographs, the wedding ring she never sold, and that chipped mug he once hated but kept using. She never mailed it. Some truths don't need an audience, only a witness. Chapter 29, The Key Mark, now living in a small cabin upstate, had left the city 3 years prior. No more courtroom wars, no more sleepless nights. He taught at a local community college and helped run a restorative justice program for youth. One late October afternoon, while cleaning out an old desk drawer, he found the key. Her key. It felt absurd now, how long he'd kept it, how heavy it felt for something so small. He almost threw it out. Almost. Instead, he drove 2 hours to the city and stood outside the apartment where they once lived. A young couple lived there now. Through the window, he saw them arguing playfully about groceries. Mark turned and walked to the river. He held the key one last time, kissed the rusted edge, and dropped it into the Hudson. Some locks weren't meant to be opened again. Chapter 30. A Future Glimpse. 15 years from the moment it all shattered, they met again. Not planned, not fate either. Just life circling back, a gallery opening in Montreal. She was there with her colleague, a sculptor. He came alone. Their names were both on the guest list for a lecture titled Art as Memory, Reconstructing the Past Through Form. They laughed when they saw each other's name tags. They didn't speak of old wounds. They admired a sculpture, twisted steel bent into the shape of a broken circle. It reminds me of us, Mark said without bitterness. Rachel nodded. And yet, still beautiful. He asked if she wanted to walk with him after. She said yes. They walked the cobbled streets until dawn. No promises. Just presence. Epilogue. Love, rewritten in the end, their story wasn't about betrayal or forgiveness. It was about what survived. Both. The space between them had once been filled with pain, silence, pride, guilt. Now, it was filled with understanding. Not all love ends in forever. Some love ends in clarity, some in peace. Final lines, they did not reclaim the past. They simply made peace with the shape of its shadow and walked into mourning with nothing left to hide. Ethan never remarried. He moved to a coastal town in Rhode Island, where he opened a small independent bookstore, quiet, sunlit, filled with handwritten notes in the margins of books he'd loved. Sometimes customers would ask about the woman, whose photograph he kept on the back wall tucked into the edge of a worn bookshelf. Rachel, laughing mid-sentence at a cafe table. Candid, free. She was a storm I walked into willingly, he once told a teenage girl who asked. And when the clouds parted, I was still standing. He wrote her once a year. Letters never sent. He burned them on the shore every December. The final letter, written at 73, read, Rachel, you once asked if I ever regretted waiting for a heart that had already wandered. I didn't, not even once. You were worth the ache. If there's another life, I'll walk slower. Maybe you'll stay longer. Chapter 32. Leah's Reckoning. Leah married a man who had never met Rachel or Mark. She moved to Chicago and started a family. 2 kids. A golden retriever named Scout. But there were nights she sat on the edge of her bed and remembered the sound of Rachel crying through the phone, the night she first confessed. I think I've ruined something sacred. Leah had told her, maybe. But that doesn't mean it can't be transformed. She always wondered if she said the right thing. She kept a journal filled with versions of that moment, what she could have said differently, better. Leah named her daughter Elise, Mark's mother's name. Rachel never knew. Chapter 33. Rachel at 70. Rachel lived alone, not lonely, alone by choice. She taught philosophy until her retirement, spent her evenings tending a rooftop garden and translating poetry no one asked for. She published a small volume of essays called Ambiguity as Compass. In the final essay, she wrote, Love is not a straight road. It is a mirror we sometimes shatter trying to see too deeply. But if we are lucky, the shards reflect light back at us in ways we never expected. She received a letter after its publication, handwritten. Mark's scrawl, I read your book. I think you finally understood what I couldn't say that day on the stairs. We were never meant to fix what broke. We were meant to learn to live with the crack in the glass. And somehow, the view through it is more honest. She smiled, folded it, and placed it next to the chipped mug in her cupboard. Final chapter. Reunion. When Mark died at 81, he left no will. But among his belongings was a small box labeled simply, Are Inside, a photograph of them on their wedding day, the poem he read at their anniversary, a pressed flower from the park bench where they reconciled briefly, and a note. If this ever finds her, tell her I never stopped carrying the version of us that almost made it. Rachel received the box through a friend of a friend, one snowy morning. She didn't cry. She didn't write back. She sat in her chair, the Hudson visible beyond frost-laced windows, and whispered, I carried you too. Final line. And in the quiet after everything, there was no longer pain, only the echo of love, softened by time. The bookstore was quieter in winter. Snow pressed against the glass in lazy flurries, and Ethan found himself lighting the fireplace more for the sound than the warmth. He had grown into the kind of man who no longer needed answers, only patterns. Morning. Routines, the slow ritual of tea, the turning of pages without rushing. Still, when the anniversary of that night came, the night Rachel broke the seal on their perfect life, he couldn't help but feel it. It wasn't bitterness anymore. That had faded. But there was a shadow of ache in the way he touched the spines of books she once adored. He kept a journal now. Not for anyone else. Just small observations, what the sky looked like in the morning, or the way a customer clutched. A novel like it contained oxygen. One entry, written without preamble, read, "She didn't lie to hurt me. She lied because she didn't know how to be honest without setting herself on fire." He'd reread that line 100 times. He never forgave her in the way people expected, but he did something quieter, harder. He understood her. Companion Story 2. Leah and the Visitor. It had been years since Leah saw Rachel in person. A wedding, some colleague's affair, a polite hello, and nothing more. So when Rachel showed up at her door in Chicago unannounced, Leah blinked twice, unsure if time had played a trick. Rachel looked older, thinner, but her eyes still held that quiet storm. "I was nearby," Rachel said. "You hate Chicago," Leah replied. "I was nearby emotionally." That made them both laugh, tension cracking just slightly. They sat on the back porch and drank tea in silence until the city sounds faded. "I read your daughter's college essay," Rachel said eventually. "She wrote about regret and how it doesn't vanish, it just changes shape." "She learned that watching me," Rachel nodded. "She learned it watching us. There was no apology. There didn't need to be one. Only a hand resting on Leah's briefly, an anchor to a time they both barely survived." When Rachel left, Leah watched her disappear down the sidewalk. It struck her, unexpectedly, that some people don't return to your life to stay. They return to show you how far you've come. Companion Story 3. Mark's letters to no one unpublished, written long after Rachel, after courtrooms and causes. Mark kept a small wooden box labeled "Not to be mailed." Inside were dozens of letters. Rachel. "Today a student asked me if I'd ever loved someone who made me question who I was. I told her that love is rarely clean. It's usually where we lose ourselves to find something more honest. She thought I was being poetic, but I was just remembering you." Another. "Do you remember the rain in Maine that one summer? You wore my old flannel and said the thunder sounded like distant regrets. You always had a way of naming things I never dared to. Maybe that was our trouble. You were always 2 chapters ahead." In his final letter, "I dreamt of you last night." We didn't speak. We just sat in silence on that park bench. It was enough. If this letter survives me, maybe that means something still echoes. Final passage. What remains? After all the years and all the unraveling, what remained wasn't rage, not betrayal, not even love in the way it once lived. What remained was recognition of having shared something unrepeatable, of being part of each other's architecture, impossible to fully tear down, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Rachel's daughter, 27 years old, narrator, close third person. Elena didn't know much about her mother's past. Rachel had been private, not cold, not withdrawn, just careful. There were stories she shared around the edges, in metaphor and philosophy, as though anything real was too brittle to be spoken plainly. After Rachel passed, Elena inherited her journals. Most were academic, dense with commentary on Kierkegaard, ambiguity, and the tension between desire and ethics, but tucked into the back of one worn notebook, under a folded sheet of paper labeled "To my daughter," if you're curious, she found the letter. "Elena, I did something once that changed the course of my life, your father's life, and another man's. It was not noble, it was not simple, but it was true, in the way that unguarded moments often are. I loved 2 people at the same time. I lied. I hurt the man who trusted me. And in doing so, I realized too late that love cannot thrive in shadow. I did not write this so you would judge me or to excuse myself. I wrote it because you will someday love someone and you may find yourself confused by the shape of that love. If you are lucky, it will be beautiful and safe. If you are not, it may burn you. Either way, let it change you, but never pretend it didn't. Your father, Ethan, was the kindest man I ever knew. He forgave me in silence. I don't think I ever deserved it, but I'm grateful. Mark was a mirror. He showed me every truth I tried to bury. I will always carry both men with me. So much of life is made of contradictions. I hope you learn to live inside them. I loved you more than anything I ever wrote, said, or taught. Mama Lena sat still for a long time. Then she picked up the phone, dialed the number for Ethan's bookstore in Rhode Island, one she had never called, and said softly, "Hi, it's Elena, Rachel's daughter. I think it's time we met." Companion. Story 5. Ethan and Elena. The meeting happened on a quiet morning. She walked into the bookstore wearing her mother's scarf, navy with white pin dots. Ethan recognized it instantly. "She wore that the day she told me the truth," he said. Elena nodded. "I know." They sat in the back room, sharing coffee. That had gone slightly cold. "She told me you forgave her," Elena said. "I never said the words, but I let go of the need to punish her. That was a kind of forgiveness. She said you were the kindest man she ever knew." Ethan smiled faintly. "I'm not sure that's true, but I loved her, even after." They didn't need to speak much more. The silence between them was weighted and gentle, full of all the things neither had the language for. Before she left, Elena placed the letter on the counter. "She wanted you to see this," she said. "Maybe not literally, but I think it's right." Ethan read it after she left, alone, by the fire, and for the first time in decades he cried, not from grief, but from recognition. He had been part of a story larger than heartbreak. He had loved someone fiercely, and now her voice lived on, in her daughter's honesty, in the quiet resilience of a new generation, trying to understand that love and pain are often two sides of the same hand. Epilogue. Stillness in the final scene. Elena visits a lakeside cabin Rachel had rented once every autumn. She scatters a few of her mother's ashes over the water, then she opens a notebook and writes, "Love does not ask us to be perfect, only honest. And when we fail, may we at least have the courage to face what remains. I never knew the full story of my mother, but I think in the end, she was brave." Claire rarely spoke about the affair anymore. People stopped asking after a while how she was, what had really happened, whether she ever saw Rachel again. She hadn't. Not since the day she stood in the courtroom beside Mark, both of them reduced to strangers under fluorescent lights. Now Claire lived in a coastal town in Maine, where the wind was constant and the ocean loud enough to drown out memory. She taught high school English, often assigning her students the crucible or atonement. When they asked about the themes, guilt, betrayal, redemption, she would pause longer than most teachers might. Sometimes, she told them, forgiveness isn't about saying it's okay. It's about choosing to stop bleeding from the same wound. At night, she wrote letters she never sent. One was to Rachel. "Rachel, I hated you. I blamed you. I imagined you regretted everything. But lately I've wondered, did you? Did you find peace? Or did you carry pieces of us with you like glass in your pocket? I think the worst thing you ever did wasn't loving my husband. It was not loving yourself enough to stop." She folded that letter and tucked it into a box labeled unsent. Right beside it, a second box, things I should have said to Mark. It remained empty, not because she had nothing to say, but because no words ever felt like enough. Companion story. 7. Mark, revisited Mark, eventually remarried. A quiet woman named Dana, who came from a family of florists and spoke with her hands when she was nervous. Dana never asked too much about the past, but once, When she found him reading a book Rachel had once signed for him, she sat beside him and asked gently, "Do you still love her?" Mark closed the book, thought, then answered, "I love the version of her I once knew. But that man I was, the one who betrayed a woman who trusted me, he doesn't live here anymore." Dana nodded, not with jealousy, but understanding. They both had histories, shadows, long corridors of memory. Love, they discovered, was not the absence of pain. It was the willingness to walk forward, still limping. Final reflections. Rachel's grave. It took Ethan 6 years to visit her grave. When he finally stood over the modest stone, Rachel May Barlow, 1979-2021, teacher, writer. Questioner. He didn't bring flowers. He brought one of her favorite books, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. He opened it to a marked page. When the heart speaks, the mind finds it indecent to object. Milan Kundera. He whispered, "You were always more heart than mind, weren't you?" Then he sat down beside her, read for a while, not aloud, just in quiet companionship. As he closed the book, a soft breeze moved through the trees. The air felt like memory, and forgiveness, he thought, wasn't about erasing what had been done. It was about making peace with what remained. Closing scene. The Stillness Between Us. Elena publishes a memoir 5 years later titled The Stillness Between Us. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't glorify. It simply tells the truth of a mother who lied and loved, of a father who grieved and endured, of a man who saw her too clearly, and of a daughter trying to assemble something whole from broken glass. Critics call it haunting and redemptive. But for Elena, it's not about success. It's about finally stepping into the silence and naming it. Final line. Not every story ends in healing. But if you listen long enough, even the fractured ones find music in their echoes. Contemporary Literary Podcast. Elena interviewed by host, close third person focused on Elena's emotions. The microphone glowed red, and Elena shifted nervously in her chair. The studio was quiet, except for the soft hum of equipment and the occasional cough from the host. Your memoir, The Stillness Between Us, has resonated with so many. How did you navigate telling such a personal story about your mother's betrayal and your family's fractured past? The host asked. Elena took a breath. It was terrifying. But I realized the story wasn't just about betrayal or mistakes. It was about what happens afterward, about silence, about what people don't say, and how that shapes us just as much as the truths we do speak. Her fingers traced the worn spine of her copy on the table. I wanted readers to understand that forgiveness isn't a neat conclusion. It's a process, messy, sometimes ugly, sometimes hopeful, but always human. The host nodded, eyes intent. Did writing it bring you closure? Elena hesitated. Not exactly, but it brought me understanding. And sometimes that's enough. Scene 2. Claire's return, Maine coastal town. Claire receives a letter from Mark, introspective narration. Claire sat at her kitchen table, a faded envelope in hand. Mark's handwriting was unmistakable. Claire, I don't expect anything. From you. But I needed to say I'm sorry for all the pain. For the things I never had the courage to say back then. I hope you're finding peace. Mark, her fingers trembled as she reread the letter. Years ago, they both had been caught in a web of anger, betrayal, and blame. Now, the letter felt like a fragile bridge. Claire folded it carefully and placed it in the box of unsent letters. Maybe she would write back someday. Or maybe, like forgiveness, some letters were meant only to be written, not sent. Scene 3. Ethan and Dana, quiet evening. Ethan and Dana sharing a simple dinner. Dialogue revealing complicated healing, Ethan poured tea into 2 chipped mugs. Dana watched him, thoughtful. "Do you ever regret not fighting harder for her?" she asked softly. He paused. "I regret the silence, the things I never said, but I don't regret loving her. Sometimes love means holding on. Other times it means knowing when to let go." Dana smiled gently. "That's the hardest kind." Nodded, staring out the window at the falling snow. "It is." Scene 4. Elena's new beginning. Elena's apartment. A letter from Ethan arrives. Hopeful tone. Elena unfolded a thin envelope postmarked from Rhode Island. Inside, Ethan had written, "Dear Elena, thank you for coming into my life. Meeting you was a gift I didn't expect. Maybe now, with our stories intertwined, we can keep writing what comes next, together or apart. Take care, Ethan." Elena smiled, a mixture of sadness and hope swirling in her chest. She placed the letter beside her manuscript. Some stories end in silence, some in forgiveness, and some just begin. Closing. Reflection. The stillness between them was no longer empty. It was full of possibility.